Are you trying to learn a new language? Have you seen ads on YouTube that tell you you can learn a language just by immersing yourself with comprehensible input? Today I want to talk about what comprehensible input is and how that works in language learning. So let's get going. Comprehensible input was hypothesized by Stephen Krashen, and it is essentially written as a formula of I plus 1. The I stands for input, which is your level of understanding for input, and then the plus 1 means just above. From an educational perspective, comprehensible input makes sense because the idea is you're using scaffolding to help you increase your ability, that's what we do in education anyway. So when we give tasks to students, a good educator would give tasks that require students to work just beyond their level, usually with the assistance of like a teacher or another peer or something like that to kind of help them, but you're not doing the work for them. So comprehensible input works in the same way. I would say though, in comparison to education, comprehensible input doesn't make sense alone because all scaffolding has someone else scaffolding for you. So there's somebody else there helping you, which is why I want to talk to you about the difference between an adult with comprehensible input and a child with comprehensible input, and then what you could expect with those types of language learning environments. Today we're going to look at the difference between L1 acquisition, L2 acquisition, and then maybe even L3 acquisition, so language 1, language 2, language 3. We're going to look at input, so what type of comprehensible input, amount, and quality. And then we're going to look at how children learn versus adults learn. One of the main premises of comprehensible input is that you'll learn a language just like a child. That's often what I see in advertisements is they say like, we're doing it backwards. We learn grammar first. It would be like learning music theory without ever touching a piano, which yes, to a degree. But the thing is when a child acquires their first language, they don't have any competing linguistic code in their head. I can't say they don't have a language because children's brains do seem to have some type of biological component for language, because even like deaf babies, for example, they'll still coo and they'll still make noises like ma 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 ba 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 da da da. They do have some type of a linguistic, I guess you could say, operating system in their brain, but they don't have a language code as they don't have Chinese in their head or English in their head. So when they're in an environment and they're being talked to or they're listening to people talking, they're able to pick up on sounds, pronunciation, intonation, tone. But what people don't understand is one of the main reasons babies learn is because they have somebody who interacts with them. And there have been studies on this. So in one study, they had children under the age of 6 months watch TV shows geared for children in a second language. So for example, maybe I'm a baby born in Taiwan, but I'm going to watch shows in English. And then they had other babies who interacted with the native speaker. So the native speaker would play with them or talk to them. And what they found was that after they reached the age of 6 months, they scanned their brains before the treatment and then after the treatment. The babies who had a live person interacting with them actually started acquiring the sounds of the other language. Really what I should say is the babies who did not have interaction, they lost those sounds because babies before 6 months of age are actually able to hear all sounds. Like their brain can distinguish those sounds. And then what happens is when they hit the age of 6 months, they start to kind of have a neural pruning, and that makes they lose those sounds in their brain, the ability to distinguish it. Which is why sometimes when you speak a second language or a foreign language, you might say a sound that sounds correct to you, but then a native speaker will say that's not right. And it's because your brain takes the closest approximation to that sound. First language acquisition, there's essentially no competition in your brain. You're not a blank slate, but you have no other linguistic code to work with. So you're not translating in your head, you're just kind of waiting until you understand things. With second language acquisition, though, you already have a language in your head, and you use that language to interpret all new incoming information. So it's really strange that people tell you, don't translate in your head. That's bad. That's literally what your brain does when you learn anything new. So to even suggest it kind of shows they have no idea what they're talking about, and they're normally full of crap. And researchers argue about this all the time too. Even if we try to keep the second language out of the classroom, or we try to force students, don't use your mother tongue, just use the second language, it still happens. They still do it. all the time. I've seen it time and time again. I mean, I've been teaching for a long time. I've seen this over and over again. I've read it in a lot of research as well. The other thing too is like if total immersion or this like comprehensible input truly was amazing, you would see studies showing that students who go abroad and live in the country would get fluent really, really fast, and they'd be really, really, really good at it. And it's not as common as people think it is. It happens, and going abroad can help. It's not like an all-encompassing help. It'll be like they get better at speaking, okay? Part of it's confidence, part of it's like they get better at understanding, but they don't improve as much as they would have in grammar or vocabulary if they were like back in their home country. So then you say like, well then obviously like learning in your home country can be better. Yeah, in some ways, just like going abroad is better in some ways. For the third language acquisition, it's even more interesting. So when you do second language acquisition, your L2 relies on your L1. In third language acquisition, your L3 relies on your L2. So if any of you have learned a third or fourth language, you might be, well, you probably know this if you've been doing it, but it might be surprising to you where you start to feel like you mix up the two languages. Whereas when you're doing your second language, you mix up your mother tongue and the second language. The third language, you start to mix up your second language more than your first language. Yeah, so there are differences between these types of interaction in the brain. For people who give you those solutions of like, it's just so easy, all you have to do is just sit there and listen. Sit there and just soak in all the words and you're going to get fluent. You might, but it's not going to be as good as you think it is. In terms of input, you have two things you have to consider. You have to consider the amount of input and the quality of input. Children will always get more input than adults. And the reason why is because they have nothing else going on. Like adults have lives, they have jobs, they have families, they have other responsibilities, they have other hobbies, other interests. Children have nothing. They literally rely on the adults around them. And if the adults around them are using a certain language, the children are going to learn that language. That's all they have. There's nothing else they can rely on. That's one thing. The other thing is quality. The quality of input depends on a few things. So like when adults talk to children, they usually do two things. They make the speech act relevant to the child, and they usually simplify it so the child can understand. But if you're talking to a native speaker, especially somebody who's not an educator, and your level is low, and you're trying to get this like comprehensible input, and you're talking to them, they're not going to say something relevant to your life. They're going to say something relevant to their life or relevant to the conversation, which may or may not have relevance to you. And they're not likely to simplify it in a good way. So they might try to simplify it, but they might oversimplify it, which isn't going to help you. That's not comprehensible input. That's just input you can understand. And so you want them to like simplify it in a way that's just above your level. And because babies, their level is basically zero, almost anything you do is going to be above their level, especially when they're first learning, or first acquiring, I should say. The last thing I want to talk about is how children learn versus how adults learn. So there are two modes of learning. You have implicit and explicit. Implicit just means subconscious. You're not necessarily aware that it's happening. I say not necessarily because you can teach grammar implicitly. So for example, let's say I put a sentence on the board, two sentences. One says, I walk to the store, and the next sentence says, he walks to the store. So I would ask the students to tell me what's the difference between these two sentences. They might say the subject, right, I and he, but they might also notice the verb. One verb adds an S. So that's like implicit, where I'm not necessarily telling them the rule, but I'm showing them there's a difference. That has been found to be beneficial to like learners that are low proficiency. So even if you're an adult and you're just starting learning, that kind of environment can be helpful for you. But the thing is you, as a teacher or even a learner, you have to have something or someone draw your attention to that difference. If you don't pay attention to it, you're not going to learn it, even if it's like something that's always happening around you. A really good example of this is there was a Japanese man named Wes. I think when he was 15, he left Japan and went to America. And he didn't really have a very good command of English. So most of his English was learned through immersion. And he got to a pretty decent level of communicative competence, so he could communicate conversationally in English. But he didn't learn grammar rules. And while most of the time that doesn't matter, there were times where he would use the wrong, for example, like he used past tense, or maybe he used the wrong grammatical morpheme for something, and it would cause embarrassment. It doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen. And he's only good conversationally. Plus, it's very evident to a native speaker that he's not a speaker of English. So he's not a native speaker of English. And I think a lot of people, when they learn a second language or a third or fourth, their goal is to get good enough to where people don't necessarily know they're a foreigner. And if you learn simply through immersion, people will be able to tell that you're not as fluent as you think you're going to be, you know. So you might get to the point where you can like talk with somebody, bounce ideas back and forth, but you're going to need somebody to pick up the slack. People who learn that way, they often have to stop to look for words, and then the listener has to guess the word and they'll say it to fill in the gap, you know. And I think most people don't want to stay at that level. Like, being at that level is not bad, but I think for a lot of people learning, especially people watching this channel, they want to get to a point where they feel like, I'm confident, I can speak my own ideas without help from other people. Comprehensible input might be really beneficial for learning, but it's not going to teach you everything. And so you need explicit instruction. And there's a lot of research showing that adults learn well with explicit instruction. There are some limitations to the studies, but generally speaking, adults do learn well with explicit instruction. And explicit instruction is just like, I directly tell you the knowledge that you need to know. Now, while people might think that means you learn grammar and grammar is bad, like, I also don't really teach grammar in class, but grammar does have a use in language and it can alter the meaning in some instances. So if you're trying to say something and you use the wrong grammar, people might misunderstand you. And if they misunderstand you, your communication failed. So I would say that that's not necessarily true to say 100% of the time grammar is bad. But there are some things that you do use explicit instruction for that have been found to be beneficial for language learning. An example of that is morphological awareness. So training students explicitly on morphemes, such as like prefixes and suffixes and root words and stems, and showing them how, if you have, for example, a root word, I was just doing it today with my students in my class, like if you have the word intervene, well, what does intervene mean? Okay, to come between something, right, to get involved. Okay, well, inter means between or among, and vene comes from venire, or I don't know if I'm saying that right, venire, I don't know, it's Latin, but I learned it in French and Spanish, but that means to come. So by them understanding those two parts of the word, now they know what that means. Well, then if I give them the word intervention, okay, well, I know ION is turning it into a noun, right, or it's turning like the act of something, so now it's the act of intervening. Right? But that has been shown to help with reading comprehension and to help with spelling. If your reading comprehension improves, you can also learn more vocabulary, because a lot of vocabulary is learned incidentally through reading. Like, think about your mother tongue. Most of the vocabulary you know is from either like hearing it or reading it. And so if students have these skills that they are explicitly taught, they can use them in their own like study. And then now they have a strategy for learning on their own. But if the goal is just comprehensible input, it's not going to be as beneficial as you think it is. Another thing too is like, depends on what you use in your language for, but writing conventions, like learning how to write in a language, it's not as intuitive as you think. Like, I was just teaching students today about academic writing in English, and I showed them sentences from a newspaper article. And then I said, how do we turn that into academic language? And they all said, isn't that academic? No, it's not. It's journalism. They're different. And that's the thing, like, if somebody doesn't explicitly tell them these are different, they have a really hard time noticing it. Even myself, like, I read Chinese. I do read research in Chinese sometimes, but if somebody told me, like, turn this, like, Koyu, this, like, oral language into academic language, I would struggle with it in Chinese. Because I focused more on listening and speaking than I did writing. I can type and I can write in Chinese, but I would say it's only conversational writing. I don't ever do like academic writing in Chinese. So the conventions need to be taught. And we know this even with our mother tongue. Like, if people don't teach you how to write, you might be able to write things like, hey, how's it going? What are you doing today? But like, if you had to write down a logical argument, it becomes really difficult if you're not used to it. It's the same concept. So I want to give a takeaway for this. If you're learning a language, comprehensible input is not bad, and in many ways it will help your language learning, but you should not solely rely on it. And any program that tells you that's what you need to do for the first 100 hours or the first 200 hours, probably not a program for you. That's probably somebody who's trying to steal your money, okay? It's really important that as you're learning, you're doing both. Like, implicit instruction and explicit instruction have both been found to be beneficial for language learning, for adults and for children. You should really value both of them. Do things that require both. If you want to do implicit and get comprehensible input, absolutely. Go listen to a podcast you enjoy. Go watch a cartoon. Go read a book. I mean, reading a book can also be comprehensible input, as long as it's slightly above your level. And for that, I would say if you're doing a book, you should understand at least 98% of what you read. So basically on a page, if there are 100 words on a page, you should have no more than 2 words you don't understand. Otherwise, that's too far. Like, you can read those books, but then it's not comprehensible input. That would just be input. Same thing with listening. Like, I've heard the 80% and 20%. It's better to have more like 95%. You want to understand most of what people are saying. Or I should say, understand at least the keywords of what people are saying. So if you, for example, if somebody's talking and you only understand the names but none of the verbs, you're not going to know what's going on, right? You'd be better off understanding the verbs, because at least you can figure out names. If it's the people involved in the story, you'll figure out names just by figuring out the people that they're talking about. Like, for example, if I say like, you go do this, even if you don't know you, but you know go do this, well, I pointed at that person, so that means that person go do this, right? Thanks for joining me again for another video. I do plan on making another video on vocabulary learning strategies, because I think that'd be really helpful for people learning the language. And it's something that I'm kind of specializing in right now. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. I love responding to people. I love having intellectual conversation. I don't mind disagreements, but I would like to keep it intellectual. There was a person on my one of my other videos who commented on my Chinese, and they said that I didn't speak very well. So I just asked them what do they mean. They just said, well, you just don't speak well. If you think that, fine, but like, give a reason, like an articulable reason for why you think that, because otherwise I don't really have anything I can respond to. So once again, thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.